Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is the Sigma 35mm f2 DGDN, a compact prime lens designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras and, at the time of testing, available in Sony E and Leica L mounts. We can all collectively hope that Sigma starts selling Canon RF and Nikon Z versions sooner rather than later. Anyway, announced in December 2020, the 35mm f2 DGDN costs around $640 or about £550. Sigma loaned me an early sample for this video, but described it as being final quality, and it certainly came in a final production box, so I'm able to show you full tests and comparisons in this video. The 35mm f2 was announced alongside a 24mm f3.5 and 65mm f2 as part of a new I series in Sigma's lineup. These are also joined by the existing 45mm f2.8. Now, these four lenses are also part of Sigma's Contemporary series, and while these are more affordable models that are positioned below the flagship Art range, I've still been getting great results from all of them. What differentiates the I series from other contemporary models though are their more compact sizes and some interesting design ideas that you'll see in a moment. Okay, onto the 35mm, which as you all know delivers mild, wide-angle coverage, making it a perfect general purpose lens. Wide enough to capture larger views or easier group shots than a standard 50mm, but avoiding the distortion of shorter lenses. Now, some photographers find them boring, I'm looking at you Chris Nichols, but others find them hugely flexible. I fall into the latter group, and if I only had one lens in my collection, it would have to be a 35, so the question then is which one to buy. The new Sigma 35mm f2 DGDN joins a crowded market, particularly for Sony E-mount owners. Sigma now has two truly native 35s for mirrorless cameras with the new f2 and the older f1.2 DGDN models, plus an older f1.4 DSLR design with a built-in adapter. Tamron has a relatively low-cost 35mm 2.8 with 1-2 close-ups. Zeiss has the manual focus f2 Loxia. Samyang has three 35s in the Sony Fit, a tiny 2.8, a new 1.8 and a bright 1.4. Sony alone has three full-frame 35s of its own, from the tiny FE 35mm 2.8 that helped launch the A7 series to the high-end FE 35mm 1.4, both those lenses coincidentally collaborations with Zeiss. But the new Sigma 35mm f2 is closest of all to the Sony FE 35mm 1.8, and while there are minor differences in light gathering, dimensions and weight, the two are very similar prospects with similar price tags too. If you're interested in the Sony lenses, I have full reviews of all three compared side by side on my cameralabs.com website, as well as a bunch more lens reviews that you might find interesting. In the L mount there's far fewer options, as at the time of testing neither Leica nor Panasonic had released a 35mm prime. As such, it's down to Sigma alone for now, which along with the adapted 35 1.4 now offers two native models, the earlier 35mm 1.2 and the latest 35mm f2, both of those DGDN. Sigma loaned me the L mount version for this video, so I'll compare it directly against the f1.2 model, and for good measure I tried them both on Sigma's own FP body as well as Panasonic's Lumix S5. Now if you're a Sony owner, fear not, for all my optical results here equally apply to the E-mount version, and again as a final production model we're going to be taking a close look at the quality. But first the design, which represents a departure from most modern mirrorless lenses, especially for the Sony and Leica mounts. For the I series, Sigma's opted for compact barrels with metal construction that are reminiscent of vintage lenses from the outside, but with thoroughly modern optical designs within. They reminded me personally of a cross between a Zeiss Loxia and one of Leica's classic lenses, which should certainly increase the appeal to owners of Leica L-mount bodies. The Sigma 35mm f2 measures just 70mm in diameter, 65mm long and weighs 325 grams, which may be 45 grams heavier than the Sony 35 1.8, but both lenses remain very small and light, which makes them perfect matches for compact bodies. I personally preferred the metal construction and retro styling of the Sigma, and like the Sony it's also dust and moisture resistant, including a rubber grommet on the mount. In terms of controls, there's a chunky switch for manual and autofocus, a clicky aperture ring that worked fine on my FP and S5 bodies, and a narrow but very smooth motor-assisted manual focusing ring. Oh, and the filter thread measures 58mm. Just compare it to the heft of Sigma's other native 35mm, the mighty f1.2 Art, which measures 88 by 136mm, weighs 1090 grams and costs around $1,500 or pounds. Now, I adore the potential of the 35 1.2, but it's a large lens to accommodate, making the 35mm f2 a much more practical, not to mention more affordable walk-around option. Sigma's also had some fun with the accessories, supplying the 35mm f2 with a classy metal lens hood that continues the ribbed styling of the lens. It also comes with not one but two lens caps, a traditional plastic one with the usual pinch spring mechanism and a new metal cap which uses magnets to stay in place. It'll hold firm during transportation too, although can't be used with filters nor easily when the hood's attached. It's a fun addition which adds to the personality of the I series, but I mostly stuck with the hood and plastic cap for my time with the lens. Okay, now let's dive into the optical results, which again apply to the Sony version. To test sharpness across the frame, I shot this distance scene with the 35mm f2 on a Sigma FP body, with the scene angled so that details ran right into the corners where lenses traditionally struggle the most. Let's take a closer look at the centre of this image taken with the aperture wide open at f2, and as you can see there's a lot of fine detail here. Closing the aperture one stop to f2.8 delivers a small boost in sharpness, which doesn't improve anymore as you close down further, but overall I'd be very happy with the centre performance wide open, which you can see again here returned back to the maximum of f2. Now moving into the corner, you'll see there's no softness to complain about even at f2, and the biggest difference as I gradually close the aperture is a reduction in corner darkening due to vignetting. As a side note, like most compact mirrorless lenses these days, the I series exploits lens profiles to correct geometric distortion and to reduce vignetting, so be sure to have them enabled in the camera or in your raw processing software. I confirmed that they were working on my Sigma FP and Lumix S5 bodies for in-camera JPEGs. Okay, let's return to the full image at f2 and now compare it to the 35mm f1.2 at f1.2, and the first thing you'll notice is how the 1.2 lens is actually delivering a slightly tighter field of view. Now it's not unusual to find two lenses of the same quoted focal length actually delivering slightly different coverage in practice, but while it's not that important, I always like to include it out of interest. Now here's a close look at the centre of both lenses at their maximum apertures, and I'd say the 35mm f2 on the left is a tad sharper than the 1.2 on the right, although if you close the 1.2 model to f2 you'll see it takes a minor lead. Ultimately though, not much to tell them apart here unless you're pixel peeping, which is good news for the new cheaper lens when you're comparing it against the high-end art model. Now for the corners of both lenses, again set to their maximum apertures, and I've cropped the same area of both images, which thanks to the slightly tighter view of the f1.2 lens means that you're looking at a slightly different area of the subject, but again I'm comparing the same area on the actual frame. As you can see, they're both delivering a decent degree of detail in the corner, and again there's little to choose between them. Closing the f1.2 model on the right to f2 reduces the corner darkening due to vignetting, but doesn't really bring any boost in detail, so again I'm calling it an approximate draw. Next, here's a portrait shot to test them at a closer distance and to see the potential for blurring in the background. After all, 35mm is an ideal focal length for events when you shoot in groups. First, here's the 35mm f2 at f2, and now for the 35 1.2 at 1.2, which was taken from the same position, where again you can see the slightly tighter coverage of the lens. Both shots were taken with the Lumix S5 using face and eye detection. Placing them side by side, and you'll see the benefit of the larger aperture coupled with the slightly greater magnification unsurprisingly gives the 35mm 1.2 on the right the shallower depth of field. The quality of the blurring, or bokeh, of the 1.2 lens is also more attractive, at least to me, with softer edges and a less busy background effect. But the 35mm f2 on the left is certainly capable of decent subject separation at this distance, and both lenses are also delivering very crisp details on my eyes. Closing the f1.2 lens on the right to f2 broadens the depth of field, bringing more of my face into focus, but of course reducing the size of the bokeh blobs. Now they're still a little larger than the f2 on the left due to its slightly greater magnification, but remain a little softer edged too. The 1.2 remains an amazing lens when shot wide open, delivering shallower depth of field effects than most wide lenses. It really brings something new and special to event photography, but for me it's too hefty as a general walk around lens. Just for fun, here's a video comparison of both lenses at their maximum apertures filming 4K on the Lumix S5 using face and eye detection with continuous autofocus. The S5 needed a little time to lock onto my face at times when filming video, especially with the added challenge of the f1.2 model on the right, but if you keep mostly still they can make great lenses for filming pieces to camera. Plus, Sony owners can enjoy more confident autofocus during video with the E-mount versions of both lenses. I should also mention that focusing was essentially silent, and when shooting photos it felt swift and accurate on both lenses. Since the biggest optical difference between the two lenses regards potential for depth of field, my third and final comparison concerns bokeh blobs for close-ups, and right now you're looking at the 35mm f2 working through its aperture range to f8. Both lenses gratifyingly allow decent close focusing, with the f2 model getting as close as 27cm, which, while 5cm more distant than the Sony 35 1.8, is still very useful. Now for the Sigma 35 f2 on the left and the 35 1.2 on the right, both from the same distance, where again the 1.2 reveals a slightly greater magnification. But with both lenses set to their maximum apertures, there's obviously no contest for bokeh blob size, with the 35 1.2 taking a significant lead. No surprises there. But as I close the apertures on both, keep an eye on the edges and the shapes of the blobs. First with the 1.2 close to f1.4, and now with them both set to f2. Now, as apertures close down, cat's-eye shaped blobs generally become smaller and more circular, although can also reveal the geometric shape of the aperture blade system in the lens. These shapes often become more obvious the more the aperture is close from the maximum value, which can give more modest aperture lenses like the f2 an advantage, because at f2.8 for example, it's only closed by one stop compared to more than 2 stops on the 1.2 model. Ultimately, the Sigma 35 1.2 can of course deliver the shallowest depth of field, but the price you have to pay is heft and a literally higher cost. Bokeh fanatics will find it hard to resist, but most of us would be very satisfied by the results from the cheaper and smaller Sigma 35 f2. So as I wrap up my review of the lens, here's a bunch of photos I took with the 35mm f2 DGDN mounted on the Lumix S5 and Sigma FP bodies. All are JPEGs out of camera and all were taken at the maximum aperture of f2. If you'd like to download any of the originals, head over to my review page for the lens at cameralabs.com, which I may expand in the future with an in-depth comparison against the Sony 35s. Okay, now for my final verdict. The Sigma 35mm f2 DGDN may not sound particularly exciting in terms of focal length and aperture, but manages to stand out in a crowded market thanks to decent optics packed into a compact, vintage-styled metal barrel at a reasonable price. It becomes Sigma's second 35mm to get me actually excited about shooting this focal length following the f1.2 art. While I love the 1.2 for its unparalleled potential for shallow depth of field effects at this focal length, the f2 is simply more affordable and practical, while sporting a degree of charm that's absent from most modern lenses. It eschews the typical bland, featureless plastic barrels for something altogether classier, with metal construction, a manual aperture ring and attractive detailing including a metal lens hood. I may not have personally fallen for the magnetic cap, but everything else about this lens resonated with me and really made me want to go out shooting with it. As you've seen throughout this review, the quality is very good, sharp into the corners, even wide open, and capable of delivering reasonable subject separation with attractive bokeh that's not too busy. I also enjoyed the minimum focusing distance, allowing me to get close to smaller subjects and details. So what's not to like? Well, beyond a little coloured fringing on some blurred high contrast subjects like branches against an overcast sky, there's not a lot to complain about. Probably its biggest issue is joining a packed market of 35s, particularly in the Sony mount. There's simply a lot of choice and competition out there, and the similarly priced FE 35mm 1.8 from Sony itself is a key rival to weigh up. I plan on making a direct comparison between them on my cameralabs.com website, so do check that out if you're interested in that lens. Overall, I was very fond of the 35mm f2 DGDN, and I appreciate Sigma trying to do something a bit different with its new I series. So many mirrorless lenses are large, hefty and physically bland these days that it's refreshing to find some decent smaller, not to mention affordable models without apparent compromise. 35mm may be the vanilla focal length, but I still think everyone should have one in their collection. Sigma's 35 f2 DGDN is a fairly unique and very welcome addition to the ever-growing family of 35s, and in my view, it comes highly recommended. Right, that's the end of another lens review. You know what I'm going to ask you to do next. If you're not already subscribed, please do give me a follow, as it really helps my channel to grow. And if you found it really useful, you could treat me to a cup of coffee. I'd really appreciate that. Or you could treat yourself to my in-camera photography book, or perhaps some Camera Labs merchandise like a t-shirt or a mug. And there's links for all of that, including checking the latest pricing of these lenses, in the pinned comment and the description below. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear in the comments what your favourite 35mm lens is. There's so many out there to choose from, aren't there? And also, let's all put in that collective vote for Sigma to make RF and Nikon Z versions sooner rather than later. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.